But we have to make America attractive on its own. And that means massive deregulation, which I know Trump is in favor of. But we need real cuts to government spending, which we're not getting. It's very disappointment that Donald Trump spent some of his day, not just attacking Canada, but he also was attacking Thomas Massie, who's the one Republican in the House of Representatives who voted against the big ugly bill. Now, Trump calls it a big, beautiful bill, but there's nothing beautiful about a bill that increases the deficit and increases government spending, right? Everybody wants to focus on Doge, right, and whatever it's pretending to do or is doing, but they're not paying attention to what's actually happening on Capitol Hill. The very programs that Doge is cutting, the Republicans in Congress are funding. They haven't turned off the spigots. The budget deficits are bigger than they were. It's still over $2 trillion a year deficit officially. I mean, unofficially, it'll be a lot more than that because, it has rosy economic assumptions that aren't going to pan out. And there's a lot of off-budget stuff that they're not counting. But Thomas Massie is like the only guy there who's willing to do the right thing. Instead of saying he wants to get rid of Massie, right? He says, we got to get rid of this guy. Somebody needs to primary him. We got to get him out of Congress because he won't play ball, right? He's an obstructionist. What he's trying to obstruct are the deficit spending that Trump says he wants to get rid of. Look, I mentioned, I think on the prior podcast, Trump did an interview and he said he'd like to balance the budget in 1 year, if not sooner. Well, if he really meant what he said, Thomas Massie is his strongest ally. He's not his, critic. He needs to get behind Massie. We need more Massies. We don't need takers to run against him. We need takers to run against the other Republicans who voted for this bill. What Donald Trump should be doing is saying, I'm going to veto this bill. Massie is right. And in fact, I'm going to veto any bill you guys send me that has an increase in the debt ceiling. That's what I'd do. I'd go cold turkey on this stuff. And I'd say, you know what? Let's all get down in a room because I want to balance the budget this year. So let's do it. But of course, it can't be done without going after entitlements. So we got to do it. And we got to eliminate departments and agencies. A lot of people got excited when he put a crypto-friendly guy at the head of the SEC. What would have got me excited? Get rid of the SEC. Right? That would have been good for everybody. We don't need the SEC. We don't need FINRA. We don't need the CFTC. We don't need the NFA. We don't need any of these regulatory bodies that operate in the financial business. I mean, I know that. They don't do anything. They run up the costs of doing business. I mean, the justification for all this government regulation is to protect investors. But investors get screwed anyway. They do all kinds of dumb things, right? Like, they're buying all these crypto ETFs, right? Did they get protected from doing that? The Ethereum ETFs are down almost 50% from when they came out in April of last year. Wall Street shoved those things down investors' throats, and they've already lost half their money if they bought on day one, and they still hodl it. But Bernie Madoff, right? The biggest Ponzi scheme ever, other than the one the government does with the debt and Social Security, but Bernie Madoff ran the biggest private Ponzi scheme in history. And he got away with that for like 20 years. He was regulated by FINRA. He was regulated by the SEC. He was audited by those guys, and they gave him their good housekeeping seal of approval. I think the main reason that Bernie Madoff got away with that Ponzi scheme for as long as he did was because people assumed that he was legit because of the government audits. He must be legit. Otherwise, the government wouldn't let him stay in business, right? People let down their guard when they think the government is doing the due diligence for them. The original Ponzi scheme, Charles Ponzi, his scheme didn't even last a year, right? It blew up. Now, when Ponzi ran his scheme, there was no SEC and there was no FINRA. So why did his scheme blow up so quickly? Because the free market put an end to it, right? The market figured it out. Maybe had there been an SEC or a FINRA around Ponzi's day, Ponzi would have been able to get away with that for a lot longer. So the point is, we don't need government to protect investors. The free market will protect investors. Reputation, competition for reputation. Now, what about fraud? Do we need the SEC or FINRA? No, because fraud is already against the law. If I defraud somebody, that's already a crime, and it's a state crime. It's a crime in every state. There's no state that says fraud's okay. So we don't need the government to go after securities fraud. Fraud is fraud. If I defraud somebody, if I sell you a car and I tell you it's got 10,000 miles, but it had 100,000, I roll back the odometer and you buy it thinking it's fraud, right? I've lied to you. I've told you something to get you to do something that if I told you the truth, you wouldn't have done, right? So if I do that with a stock, if I'm a stockbroker and I lie to you about a company, and then you buy the company based on that lie and you lose a bunch of money, well, it's fraud. We don't need the federal government. You know, the way the federal government got into the stock market was after the crash of 1929, right? Kind of blaming. It was like, you know, what we did after the financial crisis in 2008. Why did the stock market crash in 1929? Because it was a bubble. Well, how did we get a bubble? Because the Fed inflated it, just like they inflate every bubble. The Fed printed too much money in the latter part of the 1920s, especially 1925 through 1929. And they printed too much money, and that created a stock market bubble and a real estate bubble. And then they finally raised rates and pricked the bubble. And a lot of people blame the Fed for the crash because they said, well, they raised rates and that caused the crash. No, what caused the crash was the fact that they lowered them in the first place and inflated a bubble. They had to raise rates eventually. The longer they waited, the bigger the bubble would have been. And so they finally did it, and we got the stock market crash. And the government turned that into the Great Recession, not the market. But, you know, where I first learned, when I first really understood the stock market, was from Alan Greenspan. I read his article, Gold and Economic Freedom, in Ayn Rand's book, Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal. Alan Greenspan blamed the entire stock market crash on the Fed. He blamed the bubble on the Fed. And then, of course, the minute he was in charge of the Fed, he did the same thing. He did the same thing that he criticized the Fed for doing when he was, you know, writing that essay. And although Ron Paul told me that when he passed by Greenspan in the halls of Congress one day, he asked him specifically, and this is while he was Fed chairman, he asked him, hey, you know, what about your article, Gold and Economic Freedom? I mean, would you change it now? I mean, you know, and he said, no, I wouldn't change a word. So in other words, he still believes exactly what he believed back then, right? And so he's basically lying to the public about all this nonsense, but he's still the same guy. He still understands Austrian economics, hard money guy, and knows, the dangers of this Fed monetary policy. But the point is that the government created the conditions where a lot of investors speculated because of the cheap money of the Fed. They lost money, and then they overreacted. Oh, my God, we need an SEC. Oh, banks failed. We need the FDIC, right? All this crap came in during the 1930s because they said if this is why, right? We had a stock market crash because we didn't have this. Banks failed because we didn't have the FDIC. But barely any banks failed. During the entirety of the Great Depression, something like 2% of the bank deposits were lost. I mean, the banking sector did very, very well. Yes, it wasn't perfect. There were some banks that failed, but way more banks fail now than failed then. It's just that the government bails them all out. But the other problem is the entire banking system is way more levered up today than it was in the 1920s and early 1930s. So the banks were sounder without the FDIC than they are now with it. And that's because of the moral hazard. Once the government insures the banks, well, then no one gives a damn, right? No one cares what the bank does with your money because the government's got you covered. But back in the 1920s, people cared. You didn't just put your money in any old bank. You did a little research, or they had like Consumer Reports. They had companies that did research and said, here's a good bank. This bank has better lending, has a better balance sheet. Put your money there, right? It's safer, right? They don't have any of that now. I mean, we got Consumer Reports telling you which TV set to buy or which cell phone, but there's no one tells you where to bank. Who cares? Because the government has taken away all of the free market forces that would cause banks to compete based on soundness and safety, and would cause customers to reward sounder banks by putting their money there. So because of the government, we have a far less stable, more insolvent banking system now than we had in the 1920s. So we got to get rid of a lot of these government agencies and departments